The Chicago Bears have been a franchise for 105 seasons, and over that time, they have logged 81 different quarterbacks to have an official start for their team. Yet how could such a storied and long-term franchise have such inefficient QB play over all these years? 63 different draft picks have been used, including 12 in the first round to find their great quarterbacks, and while they have officially drafted 3 Hall of Famers at the position, only one of those players would actually make his Hall of Fame career as a member of the Chicago Bears. And while you look to see that of the 81 quarterbacks, they have 8 guys to have made a Pro Bowl in their time, and that may not look so bad. I will tell you that only 2 Pro Bowl quarterbacks have come past the year 1970, and 0 All-Pros, 0 MVPs, but a whole lot of heartbreak and disappointment for Bears fans all over the world. Today, we will be breaking down the 105-year history of every quarterback on the Chicago Bears, all the notables, all the draft misses, all the heartbreak that has gone down over this time to get us from the year 1920 to the year 2024. So sit back and let us take a journey through the years. This is the QB Archives. It's important we start off with who the very first quarterback of the Chicago Bears is, and that honor goes to Pard Pierce in 1920. And while stats and information from the 1920s and 30s are scarce at best, we do know that Pard Pierce was the first official quarterback of the Chicago Bears, and he started their first ever game in a 20-0 victory. Now, this did come at a time before the Chicago Bears were even known as the Bears, as they were called the Staleys until 1921, where they officially changed to the Chicago Bears and shared stadiums with the Chicago Cubs at Wrigley Field. The 5'5" quarterback Pard Pierce started 16 games in 1920 and 1921, and he opened up the era of the Chicago Bears and their very long history of inefficient QB play. While Pard Pierce was the first quarterback in team history, the first one to bring the team success and be a long-term player was Joey Sternman, who was the 5'6", 135-pound quarterback who was noted as being the strongest little man that teams had ever seen. He had 72 career starts at the quarterback position, and overall, while he was a part of the team went 62, 32, and 14. He made 2 All-Pro teams and was really the kickstarter of the first great era of the Chicago Bears, as in the pre-Super Bowl era, the Chicago Bears were a very dominant team, winning 9 NFL championships overall. Now, quarterbacks back in the day played a multitude of positions, as you know. You probably have remembered a lot of players like Sammy Baugh have been known to be quarterbacks, receivers, punt returners, kickers, safeties. You see their stat lines are ridiculous, and for Joey Sternman, it was no different. He had 20 rushing touchdowns, 4 receiving, a punt return touchdown, 10 passing touchdowns, and 13 field goals made in his 8 years with the Chicago Bears. Unfortunately for him, the championships did not start rolling in Chicago until the early 30s and 40s, but he was a catalyst for the Chicago Bears to set them up for a great future in the early stages of football. Now, you're going to see a little bit of overlap here, as from 1926 to 1929, they also had Patty Driscoll at quarterback / a whole other bunch of positions. Starting quarterbacks seemed to rotate like crazy, and Patty Driscoll was one of the guys that was there along with Sternman, and he too was a 2-time All-Pro, but he was able to do it at a bunch of different positions, as well as he was able to play drop kicker and halfback. But we call him Mr. Do-It-All because he didn't just do it in the NFL as a player. He was also a coach, a vice president, and also had a short stint in the MLB as a part of the Chicago Cubs. He as well is a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, but his greatest career achievements did not come as a member of the Chicago Bears. He wrapped up his career from 1926 to 1929 as a member of the Bears. It was the Cardinals where he spent most of his career, becoming overall a 6-time All-Pro, but only 2 of those being for the Bears. A Pro Football Hall of Famer, like I said, and he wasn't a bad coach either, with a career win percentage of 62% in the NFL. He finished his career with 18 passing touchdowns, 25 rushing, and 4 receiving. As a member of the Cardinals, he was known as one of the first true star players in all of football, got to finish his career on the Chicago Bears, and even got to coach them many years later. Technically, the first championship in Chicago Bears history came before 1930, but it was under the name the Staleys, and while it is still credited in their franchise's history, I want to focus on the first championship under the name the Chicago Bears and their almost three-peat, as Carl Brumbaugh was the quarterback of the team for the 1930s, where they almost three-peated as they had a legendary roster with Hall of Famers Red Grange, Bronco Nagurski, and in 1932 they were champions, 1933 they were champions, and played for another championship in 1934 with this guy leading the charge. I know us modern fans look at those numbers and are wondering what in the world was going on back then, but football back in the day was a very different sport, and having 29 completed passes in a 7-year career for the Chicago Bears, while interesting, it was enough to get them 2 championships, and he threw 9 touchdowns to 11 picks in his career, which honestly, that's not that bad considering how many more interceptions were thrown back in the day compared to touchdowns. So having a touchdown to interception ratio almost 1-to-1 is pretty decent. Perhaps he was the first ever game managing quarterback in Bears history? I don't know. Like I said, stats are pretty scarce, but we're getting into the more detailed quarterbacks as we continue to move along on the timeline to the next quarterback in Bears history to round up the 30s and begin the 40s. It did not take us long to get to the greatest quarterback in Bears history, that being Sid Luckman, the number 2 overall pick in the 1939 draft, and the only true Hall of Famer in Bears history at the quarterback position. The pioneer of the T formation, part of the most dominant victory in NFL history, and a multiple-time record holder and a MVP winner. There is no debate over who the greatest Bears quarterback in history is, and as we get into everything that Sid Luckman did, we start with an offer from legendary head coach George Halas to Sid Luckman to join the Chicago Bears for $5,500, and he accepted, and he was the basis of the T formation offense that he built his entire team around, and it revolutionized the NFL forever. And the biggest example of that was in a 73-0 victory over the Redskins. A lot of the things you see today, especially with this stage of the NFL where a lot of pre-snap motion is taking place and a lot of innovative and creative ways to get guys on the move, it is traced all the way back to Sid Luckman and the Bears T formation offense, where it was the man in motion innovation that helped them absolutely annihilate Washington, and it left the defenses absolutely confused, and it took a long time for the NFL to figure it out and catch up, as from 1940 to 1946, they played in 5 NFL championships, they won 4 of them, and went 54, 17, and 3 in the regular season, including an 11-0 record in 1942, outscoring opponents 376 to 84. He was told to throw the football unlike any other quarterback the history of the game had ever seen up until that point, as a lot of the quarterbacks that we had taken a look at in the Bears history and just in the NFL at the time, the throwing the football wasn't very efficient or asked to be done a whole lot. But when we see his 1943 stat line, it does not look out of place with even recent NFL history, as he had 2,200 yards, 28 touchdowns to 12 interceptions in 1943, an absolutely insane outlier, and he also missed a game that year, so his numbers would have been even better. He took home MVP that year, and not only that, he had a record-tying 7-touchdown game against the Giants in a 56-7 victory, so he also holds the NFL record in joint with a bunch of other players for 7 passing touchdowns in a game. But that's not the only NFL records that he holds, as in terms of players with a certain amount of attempts, I would imagine over 200 attempts, he has 11 yards per attempt and 20 yards per completion in his 1943 season. His efficiency was off the charts, and for quarterbacks that were not completing a very high percentage passes, as most quarterbacks around this time were hovering around 40 to 50-ish%. In his 1943 season, he also completed 54% of his passes, a career high in 1941 of 57% of his passes, and his career overall 51.8% of his passes completed, and on top of that, more touchdowns than interceptions, which today is expected, but back then was not seen very often. Truly a legendary player, a revolutionary player, and a guy who is more than deserving of his Hall of Fame status, as he was a sought-after coach post-career to try to implement that revolutionary T-formation offense. He is a 6-time All-Pro, a 4-time champion, and a certified legend, not just in Bears history, but NFL history. Even in the earliest stages of football, the sport was still very much a copycat league, as even in the earliest of days, when Sid Luckman's passing boom really hit the league, teams tried to copy it, implement it, and try to pass more, but the Bears continued to try to innovate, and as Luckman's career winded down, things turned over to Johnny Lujack. The former Heisman winner and 3-time national champion at the University of Notre Dame didn't have a very long NFL career, but it was an impactful one and full of some records at the time. In 1950, he set the NFL record by doing something no quarterback had ever done up until that point: 11 rushing touchdowns, and it was a record that stood for 26 years until Steve Grogan of the New England Patriots broke it, but a 26-year-long record for rushing quarterbacks. And not just that, he also, in 1949, in the final game of the regular season, had an NFL record of 468 passing yards in a game, and that was a record that stood until Norm Van Brocklin's record-breaking performance, a record that he still holds to this very day. Despite such a short playing career, he was an All-Pro and 2-time Pro Bowler, an NFL passing touchdowns leader, rushing touchdowns leader, passing yards leader, and was just an incredible player in college and in the NFL. But after a 4-year career, he returned to Notre Dame to become a coach, which seemed to be his true passion, was the school of Notre Dame. But who knows how good of a career Johnny Lujack could have had if he continued playing for the Chicago Bears and played out his entire career. We could be looking at the team going from Hall of Fame quarterback Sid Luckman to Hall of Famer Johnny Lujack, because he was definitely on that trajectory. As if the retirement of Johnny Lujack early on wasn't frustrating enough for the Chicago Bears, I talked about how they had drafted 3 Hall of Famers, only one of them making their Hall of Fame career as a member of the Bears. Well, in back-to-back drafts, they drafted 2 more Hall of Fame quarterbacks, that being Bobby Lane and George Blanda. While they drafted George Blanda and he played there for 10 years, he only started in 3 different seasons, 1952, 53, and 54, only starting a combined 21 games for them. And while he was not the best of quarterbacks, he did go on to become a Hall of Famer in Oakland and in Houston. Blanda and Coach George Halas did not have a very good relationship, as Blanda felt the game had passed Halas by. Halas didn't think he was a starting caliber quarterback, as he just stuck him there at kicker. And eventually, Blanda seemed to have proved him wrong, as he went on to become a Hall of Fame kicker and quarterback. Now, Bobby Lane's situation is a bit different and a lot more interesting, as he was drafted to the Steelers, who he just didn't want to play for. He refused to be drafted by the Steelers, basically, so his draft rights were shifted over to the Bears, who get credited for drafting him with the number 3 overall pick, and he was promised to be the future star of Chicago, as Sid Luckman was at the tail end of his career. But what he was not prepared for was the emergence and breakout of Johnny Lujack. So in 1948, he was the 3rd string quarterback, and after just a single season, he demanded a trade, as he was very unhappy with his lack of playing time. He tried to force a trade to the Green Bay Packers, though that did not work. He was eventually traded to New York, and just a year after the trade to New York, he ended up in Detroit, and Bobby Lane is best known in his career for cursing the Detroit Lions for 50 plus years, saying they'd never win another Super Bowl or never win anything as long as he wasn't there anymore. So it really makes me wonder, because the whole Bobby Lane situation came right at the end of Sid Luckman's career. One has to wonder, is there another curse active, as the Lions curse seemingly had finally been broken this past year, with them finally being able to have an ounce of success? But I do wonder, did Bobby Lane curse the Bears with bad QB play and bad quarterback history for the next 60, 70 years, with the way things end up going as the quarterback play. They had Sid Luckman, they had Lujack, they drafted Lane, they drafted Blanda, but man, it gets real downhill from here, especially the further we get into things. We already talked about the what-ifs of Johnny Lujack, but how about next we talk about the never-weres, that being highly drafted players for the Bears that never even played a snap for them. We start off in 1957, where Ronnie Knox was a third-round draft pick, signed with the Chicago Bears, and then was immediately suspended indefinitely over the fact that his stepfather made comments criticizing the Chicago Bears, and then he missed 2 practices. That led to him not just being banned from the Chicago Bears, but the entire NFL. He never played a single snap in the NFL, and maybe that's a little too much for a guy who had a dispute with the team. His stepfather made some comments and he missed some practices, but I don't know, maybe there's more to the story that we don't know, but that is quite the punishment for such a minor thing, it seems like. Or next, how about first round pick, 10th overall draft pick Frankie Albert, who in 1942 was serving in World War II. He didn't make it back till 1945, but he never joined the team. In 1946, he joined the San Francisco 49ers, played till 1952, and became an all-pro player, so I guess it was a good draft pick, but for not the Chicago Bears, as they got none of the benefits of drafting him 10th overall. And this final one is arguably even weirder than the previous two, as in 1960, Don Meredith was drafted in the 3rd round by the Chicago Bears, but Bears owner George Halas made the pick to ensure that the expansion Cowboys got off to a good start, so they drafted him and basically handed him over to the Cowboys, where he would also become an All-Pro and a 3-time Pro Bowler and a part of the Cowboys Ring of Honor. So the Bears, basically, among these 3 players, drafted 2 All-Pros who never played for their team, but had success in other places. It just goes to show how insane the NFL was back then with some of the draft rights and how players moved from team to team, and especially how things like war affected the NFL, as Frankie Albert just was drafted while he was overseas, so he showed back up, and I guess the Bears didn't retain his draft rights, and he just got to walk on and play for another team. Crazy how the NFL worked back in the day, and it's maybe a good thing we have a bit of structure nowadays. After the departures of many Hall of Fame and Hall of Fame potential players, the Bears didn't have the best of times finding the best of quarterbacks over the years, as the most stable starters that they had through the 50s and 60s was firstly starting quarterback Ed Brown, who started from 54 to 1961, and while he did produce a winning record as a starter and even made a championship game, said championship game did not go well as they lost 47-7 over the New York Giants, and while he did make a Pro Bowl, he declined very quickly in his play, as he was basically just an air-it-out deep bomb quarterback. But when Brown's play eventually dropped, they called the LA Rams and traded for their quarterback in Billy Wade, and he helped lead them through the 1960s. He did become the first quarterback in Bears history to have 4 straight 300-yard passing games, and in 1963 did lead them to their final championship game as they beat the Giants, something that Ed Brown could not do, but it was the final time that the Bears would win an NFL championship before it became the Super Bowl as we now know it. He quarterbacked the team for a couple more seasons, won 39 games to just 25 losses and the 2 ties. He made 2 Pro Bowls, and while his numbers were a bit less efficient and more sporadic with the interceptions and completion percentage than Ed Brown, he did lead the team to its last successful period pre-Super Bowl era. As we head into the 70s, the Bears would undergo a bit of a struggling time, as no longer the dominant powerhouse, with George Halas been retired by this point. They turned to quarterback Bobby Douglas, who once again tried to innovate and do things that were never done before by the quarterback position, and he did just that. Despite his 13-31 record as a starting quarterback for Chicago and just 42% completion percentage, he did hold the record for the most rushing yards by a quarterback in an NFL season at 978, that being a record that stood for 34 years until it was broken by, guess who? Michael Vick in 2006. He's one of the original dual-threat quarterbacks in the NFL, as with a career rushing total of 2,500 yards, and in a 5-season span of 47 games where he ran for 2,000 yards, he averaged 43 rushing yards per game, which is the third highest average for a quarterback in a 3-year span, also trailing Michael Vick, who ranks number 1. So while the Bears definitely weren't a good team around this time, they certainly were entertaining with Bobby Douglas at the helm for the quarterback position. I do think it is important that we note certain milestones in the franchise's history, as well as in 1977, they did draft quarterback Vince Evans, and he would go on to become the first ever African-American quarterback in Bears history. It took far too long for certain teams to be open to the idea of a black starting quarterback in the NFL, and thank goodness that nowadays it is a commonplace thing to see black quarterbacks all over the NFL, but in the 1970s and before that, it was a much rarer occurrence. But for the Bears, they finally did start one in the late 70s to early 80s, and Vince Evans was their guy for 30 games, going 10-20 as a starting quarterback. He may not have been as successful as other quarterbacks on this timeline, but he was definitely a barrier breaker in his own right for being the first African-American quarterback in the team's history. And not just that, actually, is he was the final quarterback to carry the Bears through the 70s before they hit their boom period in the 80s, where we got the best version of the Chicago Bears in the Super Bowl era. In the 1982 draft, the Bears spent the 5th overall pick on BYU superstar quarterback Jim McMahon, and he immediately came in with Coach Mike Ditka, Hall of Fame running back Walter Payton, and that stout defense that would come to be great in the 80s, and immediately showed signs of helping turn this team around and being the guy that can lead this team into great success. He showed serious promise in his early years, as in 83 he took over the job and helped push the Bears to an 8-8 record, and in 1984 the Bears finally broke through as he played his best football up until that point. Unfortunately for McMahon, a 7-2 start was knocked off course as he sustained an injury that ended his season, but it wasn't going to stop the Bears, who made it not just to the playoffs, but all the way to the conference championship, where they unfortunately came up short. But everyone was excited for what was next for the Chicago Bears, and for great reason, as in 1985, we all know the historic defense that the Bears possessed. The 85 Bears went down as arguably the greatest defense in NFL history, and Jim McMahon did not lose a single game as the starting quarterback of the Bears, going 11-0 on the road to not just a Pro Bowl appearance, his only one of his career, but a Super Bowl trophy victory. And Jim McMahon became the first Bears quarterback ever, and to this point, the only Bears quarterback ever, to raise the Lombardi Trophy. That was the high point of McMahon's career, as in 86, in their bid to repeat, he was given a very dirty shot from Packers defensive tackle Charles Martin that ended his season, and then in 87, he came back from another injury in a strike-shortened season and helped put the Bears to an 11-4 record, but they were not able to come out on top as they lost to the eventual Super Bowl champion Washington Redskins. And things seemed to really unravel, as in 88 they were the 1 seed, and by playoff time they were in the NFC Championship against the San Francisco 49ers once again, but were unable to get it done as McMahon was benched, ending his Bears career. He did have a falling out with Coach Mike Ditka and the ownership, which led him being traded to the San Diego Chargers at the time. Still, though, McMahon went down as one of the best quarterbacks in Bears history and one of the most talented quarterbacks that the Bears have ever had. But unfortunately for him, injuries were in the way quite a bit, as he only played double-digit games twice in his 7 years in Chicago. And after that Super Bowl victory, he never played double-digit games in the regular season for them again before being traded. And it seemed like some injuries really did hurt his play as well. But overall, he still went 46-15 as a starting quarterback, as whenever he did play, they didn't lose very much. I mean, you could take a look at his records by year outside of his first 2 seasons when the Bears really started to get it going in 84. 7-2, 11-0, 6-0, 5-1, 7-2. He did not lose, and Part of it was obviously because you have a great defense, and then you had Walter Payton on offense, but with him at the starting helmet quarterback, they did not lose very often, and it's unfortunate that we didn't get to see more of McMahon on the Bears while he was healthy. He was a fun player, he was a very, very strong personality, and he was really one of the stars of the 80s at the quarterback position. He was controversial, he was cool, and he has a lot of fun stories out there about him that I really recommend you go look at, because he was a really fun player to research about. So I would say definitely mine and many others' favorite quarterback in Bears history, especially up until this point, as this is the second high point that we hit in Bears history as we go from Sid Luckman, many years of success and failure up and down, and then Jim McMahon in the 80s. The 80s would serve as the final time the Bears were a truly dominant force in the NFL, as while they had many great years following, none hit the highs of the mid-80s, and the quarterback play definitely didn't hit the highs of guys like Sid Luckman and Jim McMahon, as we will soon see. We go from the fun Jim McMahon and his personality to a guy who has just as much personality, also named Jim. It's Jim Harbaugh, who we know him now as an amazing football coach from the 49ers, Michigan national champion, and now the head coach of the LA Chargers. But once upon a time, he was a starting quarterback in the NFL, and a pretty solid one as well. Most of his best years came in Indianapolis. He started his career as a first-round pick for the Chicago Bears in 1987. Now, his first 3 years, he only was able to start a combined 7 games, going 2-5 in those games. But once Jim McMahon left and he was able to win the starting position, in 1990, he led the Bears to a 10-4 record, but he got injured, unfortunately, and missed the remainder of the season. The Bears would go 11-5, make the playoffs, but he would not be able to participate. But still, a 10-4 record for his first full year as a starter is not too bad, and he showed signs of potentially being the Bears quarterback to go forward. He would peak in 1981 for Chicago as he became the first quarterback since Vince Evans, who we previously mentioned, to start all 16 games in the regular season, something Jim McMahon was never able to accomplish. The Bears went 11-5. He had his best season in Chicago, throwing for 3,100 yards, 15 touchdowns, 16 picks, took him to the playoffs, and in his one and only playoff game in Chicago, he unfortunately did lose. That would prove to be his high point in Chicago and the end of the Bears that we knew in the 80s, as Mike Ditka was soon gone, and Jim Harbaugh and Jim McMahon's injuries and Harbaugh's overall inefficiency to be a great quarterback potentially prevented the Bears from winning more than one ring, and it would lead to them going 5-8 under Harbaugh in 92, 7-8 under him in 93, and it finally ended with him being moved to the Indianapolis Colts, where he found his best success, coming fourth in MVP, making his only Pro Bowl, and taking the Colts to the brink of a Super Bowl appearance. As we know Jim Harbaugh as an amazing coach, but he was still a solid quarterback in his time in the NFL, having 140 starts over his time, having 75 for the Chicago Bears, where he did put up a winning record, 2 double-digit win seasons, 2 playoff appearances, played in a playoff game, and overall carved out a nice career for himself. So he was a nice quarterback, but he's an even better coach. Now let's take a look at a quarterback who in most franchises' history would have a career that would be awfully forgettable, but for the Chicago Bears not so much, as in 1987, Eric Kramer went undrafted, signed with the Saints, bounced around from the Falcons, had to go to the CFL to the Calgary Stampeders before finally landing in Detroit in 91, playing backup until 93, until the Bears finally brought him in 94, where he got an opportunity to play quarterback in Chicago, and not just that, be a starter. He served as the backup in 94, but in 1995 was handed the keys and had all 16 games started under his belt, went 9-7, and had a ridiculous outlier of a season as he held the franchise record for passing yards and touchdowns in a season. He had 3,800 yards, 29 touchdowns to 10 interceptions, which is a really nice season, and he still to this day holds the records for passing yards and touchdowns in a season. No quarterback in Bears history has ever hit 4,000. No quarterback in Bears history has ever had 30 touchdowns. And that is something wild, because 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns is something a bunch of quarterbacks will do every year nowadays. And the fact that no Bears quarterback ever has done it in their 105-year history is kind of wild. Not just that, though, he also holds the franchise record for most passing attempts in a game with 60, and that outlier season of 29 touchdowns and 10 picks seen him come crashing right back down to earth as he went 1-3 his following year, started a whole season, went 4-9, going 14 touchdowns for 14 picks, and then went right back to the bench, and then found himself out of the league in 2 more years. So he really was a one-year wonder, and probably one of the more forgettable one-year wonders. His 1995 season would serve as a nice year for most teams in the NFL, but for the Chicago Bears, this is the best season a quarterback has had statistically. And while, like I said, he'd be pretty forgettable in any other team, in Chicago Bears history, he is number 1 in single-season yardage and touchdowns. As we go towards the 2000s, let's take a look at some of these notable quarterbacks who also had pit stops in Chicago. First being Doug Flutie in 86 and 87, who only was able to start in 2 games, but after one of Jim McMahon's season-ending injuries, he came in, won a game, and then got into a playoff game where he, in his just second career NFL start, was unable to pick up a victory over Washington, who scored 20 unanswered points in the second half to beat them in overtime, and then he was quickly dealt to the Patriots right after. Or how about a player that Steelers fans are very familiar with in his post-Steeler career? Kordell Stewart made a pit stop in Chicago for the 03 season and started 7 games, throwing 7 touchdowns to 12 interceptions, and was ultimately ineffective and out the league in another year. But Kordell Stewart, some may not know, he had a stop in Chicago as well. Then we have Jim Miller, who holds the interesting distinction of being the first quarterback in NFL history to be suspended from the NFL for a violation of a substance abuse policy. The first quarterback to hold that distinction. But Jim Miller also, after the suspension, was released and then brought back to the team, where he had an improbable 2001, leading the Bears to an 11-2 record that year and a playoff appearance. But that was the only notable thing that he did in his career, as every other season he didn't win more than 2 games and rarely started for them. Finally, there was also Chris Chandler, if Falcons fans remember him. He was the quarterback who took the Falcons to the Super Bowl in 1998 against the Denver Broncos. He, after that, had a couple of down years in Atlanta, found himself in Chicago to round out his career, where he went 5-8 and also had some very ineffective play in his time in Chicago. I would really only expect Bears friends from around this time to remember that all these players played for them in Chicago, and most of them pretty ineffective. Jim Miller had that one random year, but for the most part, just a bunch of guys who came through and were out just as quick as they came in. Now, there's going to be some debates over who the biggest bust for the Bears is in terms of first-round draft picks, but I'd like to make my argument that it is Cade McNown, as some of the other quarterbacks have had at least some success or shown some flashes. Cade McNown showed absolutely none of that, as he was picked in the first round in the 1999 draft, 12th overall, and he only lasted in Chicago for 2 years, managing to only win 3 games over that time. He was thought to potentially be the guy to take the Chicago Bears into the 2000s and be their franchise quarterback, yet he had poor performance after poor performance. And not only that, he has been cited as being a really cocky player who boasted about his signing bonus in front of veteran players who were earning minimum salary. He taunted money in the face of his veteran teammates and managed to only win 3 games in 2 years, throwing more interceptions than touchdowns and only passing for 3,000 yards. Just 2 years after being a first-round pick, he was traded to the Dolphins along with a 7th for a 6th and a 7th round pick, and immediately just fell out the league as he was drafted in 99 and played his final season in 2002, just not even ever throwing a pass for a team outside of Chicago. Busts are typically more associated with the top 5 picks, if someone's taken number 1, number 2 overall, but you can be a big bust regardless of where your draft position is in the first round. And when you're taken 12th overall and are out of the league in 4 years and not throwing a pass for a team in 2 years, winning 3 games as a starter, I think it's pretty clear to me that Cade McNown is the biggest bust quarterback in Bears history. Things do not get much better, as you can argue that 2004 for the Bears was the worst year of quarterbacking they have ever put out in their 105-year history, as relative to the era, this is some of the most disgusting quarterback play I have ever seen, and it comes down to these 3 guys right here, all who played games for them in 2004 as they dealt with a lot of injuries. Jonathan Quinn managing to play 3 games and only passing for 400 yards, 1 touchdown to 3 picks, and lost every single start. The best quarterback, if you really want to say that, Craig Krenzel, who is known for his time at Ohio State, but not so much his time in the pros, who managed to win his first 3 starts and then immediately lost his next 2 and played awfully, got hurt. And not only that, Craig Krenzel never threw another ball in the NFL ever again. And then the keys were handed over to Chad Hutchinson, who managed to go 1-4, passing for 900 yards, 4 touchdowns, 3 picks, solidifying an abysmal season where these quarterbacks combined for a record of 4-9. The mid-2000s is when the Bears really started to build a great defense. Guys like Brian Urlacher, Lance Briggs, Julius Peppers, Charles Tillman, just all these awesome and fun players started to come onto the team in the 2000s. And I apologize to each and every single one of them who had to deal with this ineptitude at the quarterback position, because it is impossible to win a game when you have this on your offensive side. But there was an intended starter. None of these 3 were the intended starters, as they combined for 13 games, but the intended starter is actually the next quarterback we will be talking about. It wasn't long after the draft pick of Cade McNown that the Bears went back into the first round to take another quarterback with number 22 overall in the 2003 draft. They went ahead and selected Rex Grossman. Playing time for Grossman came difficult at the early stages of his career, as in 2003 he was sat behind the other veterans and allowed to develop, and then in 2004 he was going to be given the reins to the offense. As we just seen in the 2004 season, he only got to play 3 games as he sustained a season-ending ACL injury, leaving that abomination of a quarterback season to take place. As if things couldn't get worse for him, in the preseason of 2005, he broke his ankle and missed all but 1 game in the season, coming back at the very end to lead his team to a victory, and then he played the playoff game in which he performed pretty poorly, going 17-41 for under 200 yards, a touchdown, and a pick in a Bears loss. So your first round draft pick potential franchise quarterback has just completed 3 seasons in the NFL, and has only managed to start about 7 games in that time, which is obviously abysmal. And going into his final season of his rookie contract, he had plenty to prove. And, well, in the 2006 season, things finally looked up for the Chicago Bears, who were able to have a sustained starting quarterback who wasn't the worst quarterback of all time on their team, and it led them to going 13-3 behind that legendary defense, peaking at the right time. Grossman played his only somewhat redeemable season of his NFL career, throwing for 3,200 yards, 23 touchdowns, 20 interceptions, but he started every game, and he righted the ship as they cruised through the playoffs, winning their first 2 games and eventually making it to the Super Bowl to square off against Peyton Manning and the Indianapolis Colts. And as we know how that game started, it was magical watching Hall of Fame return man, the greatest to ever do it, Devin Hester, run a kickback all the way to the end zone and give the Bears an early touchdown lead. But that is the high point of that Super Bowl for Bears fans, as things came crumbling down, when it's Peyton Manning versus Rex Grossman. Peyton Manning was able to secure his first ring, and if it wasn't for the fact that it was Peyton Manning's first ring and the fact that Devin Hester had that legendary kick return, we're looking at one of the most forgettable Super Bowls in the modern era, as really Rex Grossman making a Super Bowl is one of the biggest anomalies when it comes to quarterbacks in the big game. He went on to throw 2 interceptions in the Super Bowl, including a pick 6, and had 2 fumbles. And you can argue very easily that if they just had a competent, good quarterback under center, that Bears team was well on their way to winning a ring, even if it wasn't in 06, 05, 06, 07. One of these seasons, the Bears very well could have won a ring and solidified their defense as one of the greatest of all time. Obviously not 85 Bears level, but still, I would say this is the second greatest roster outside a quarterback that the Bears have had of all time. As we have seen with these Bears quarterbacks, you get one maybe decent or good season or one successful season. That's the high point, and things came crashing right back down as he only started 7 games the following year, went 2-5, and then only 1 game in 2008, and then he was out of there, never to start again for the Chicago Bears. He bounced around to Houston and Washington before being out of the league at 32 years old, and genuinely this team could have won a Super Bowl if they had a good quarterback, and it is unfortunate that they just couldn't do it. Now, what if I told you in the past 20 years, the Bears have only had 5 quarterbacks to log double-digit starts, and only one of those 5 has a losing record? You might think that sounds pretty good, but man, the defense is doing some heavy lifting here, because following and during the Rex Grossman era, they also had Kyle Orton. After being selected in the 4th round of the 2005 draft, Orton was immediately placed in a position he may not have been ready for, as with the Rex Grossman injury in 05, he had to start 15 games, and while his numbers were not great, throwing 9 touchdowns to 13 interceptions, the Bears still managed to win 10 games, and then Grossman came back to win the final game, losing the playoffs. He did not play at all in 2006, and then in 2007 was managing to start 3 games, leading them to a 2-1 record, but by that point, things had gotten real bad, and Rex Grossman was up out of there, and they turned the reins to Kyle Orton in 2008. Once again, Orton would manage to win games on the back of a great defense, going 9-6 on the season, but he had his best year as a pro up until that point, throwing 18 touchdowns to 12 interceptions. But the Bears knew that if they were going to capitalize on this defense, they needed to make a move. They needed to get a franchise quarterback, and they needed to go all in. Which is why, in the 2008 offseason, Kyle Orton, along with 2 first-round draft picks, was traded. In the offseason the following year, Jay Cutler was traded to the Chicago Bears for the aforementioned Kyle Orton, 2 first-round picks plus other draft capital. He had a falling out in Denver with Coach Josh McDaniels and found his way out. Following a Pro Bowl season, the quarterback who had an absolute rocket arm and a former first-round pick found his way to potentially being the Chicago Bears franchise quarterback and had all the potential in the world to be their savior and make himself a legend in Bears history. Cutler immediately came in and led the Bears to a struggle of a 2009 season, losing 8 of 10 games at one point and throwing a league-leading 20 interceptions in that span. Yet, the Bears still went 7-9, but missed out on the playoffs, yet some were still optimistic about Cutler's potential and his future in Chicago, and they, to an extent, were to be proved right, as this is just the start of Jay Cutler's time in Chicago, where the following season in 2010, everything finally came together the way the Bears wanted it to, as in 2010, they go 10-5. Cutler only missing 1 game. He throws 23 touchdowns to just 16 interceptions. He really cut the interceptions down, had completed over 60% of his passes, and the Bears were back in the playoffs, this time with a franchise quarterback in their opinion, and that's when everything for Jay Cutler just never seemed to be the same again, because as we all know, they won their first 2 playoff games, and then the Green Bay game happened in the conference championship. It was a close, contested game, but Cutler had completed only 6 of 14 passes for 80 yards and a pick before sustaining a sprained MCL, and rather than playing out the injury and being there for the team, he did not come in, leaving Caleb Haney to clean up the job and ultimately lose the game by 1 score to Green Bay, and a lot has been made. Did he sit out? Did he not care? Could he have played through it? A lot of people will bring up other instances. A guy like Phillip Rivers had played through a torn ACL in a playoff game just to be there for his team. There's been lots of gutsy performances. So a sprained MCL by comparison doesn't look so bad. Many have defended him. Many have gone against him. Some criticized his lack of leadership and lack of commitment to the game. Others tried to defend him and say that he was really hurt, too bad to come back in. Well, regardless of what you think, he did not play, and that was the Bears' last successful season, as in 2011, things went right back down as Cutler sustained an injury. They started 7-3, but he got hurt, and it did not go well, as in 2012, they did go back to 10-5 under Jay Cutler. Ultimately, they finished with a 10-6 record and did not make the playoffs despite that. And really, Jay Cutler never played another playoff game again following that, and after that 2012 season, never had another winning record, as in 2013 he went 5-6, 2014 5-10, 2015 5-9, 2016 he went 1-4 and found his way out of Chicago, leaving behind a very odd reputation as a player who just didn't care, a player who wasted his talent. He had the players on defense to carry him to the Super Bowl, and then on offense they had really great guys like Brandon Marshall, who's arguably a Hall of Fame level receiver, a really underrated running back, and a guy like Matt Forte. Eventually Alshon Jeffrey joined the picture, and they had talent on both sides of the football to go far. It just didn't happen under Jay Cutler, and regardless if it was just one of those things where they weren't good enough, or he wasn't good enough, or he just didn't care, I'm not in the belief that Jay Cutler just straight up never cared, but he has that reputation, and despite being the all-time passing leader in Bears history, he is not very well regarded in Chicago among many, and leaves a very odd history and legacy in the world of Chicago sports. I called Cade McNown the biggest bust quarterback in Bears history, but that is not the biggest mistake they made, as Mitch Trubisky, while much better of a player than Cade McNown, is the biggest mistake that the Bears have made. And it wasn't just for where they took him and who they took him ahead of, but the Bears held the number 3 overall pick in that year's draft, traded up to 2, giving up an unnecessary haul that included a 3rd-round pick that turned out to be Fred Warner to the 49ers, and they drafted Mitch Trubisky. Now, not only was Mitch Trubisky not someone who should have gone that high, we also know that Patrick Mahomes was drafted later on in the 1st round, making it an even bigger mistake as you look back and say, how in the world was Patrick Mahomes not the first QB taken? It was Mitch Trubisky, and he had a lot to prove, and honestly, for some time, he looked like he maybe had some promise to him, obviously not Mahomes level. In his rookie season, he quite honestly played very poorly, winning only 4 of his 12 starts, throwing 7 touchdowns to 7 picks. But while he looked poor in his first season, things turned around with the head coaching hire of Matt Nagy from the Kansas City Chiefs, which helped the Bears go 11-3 in his 14 starts, and with acquisitions on the defensive side of the football to help bring the Bears to another playoff appearance where they had great defense and a solid rushing attack. They were looking like they could potentially be contenders once again, and with a 24 touchdown, 12 interception season and a Pro Bowl appearance from Mitch Trubisky, maybe the Bears were going to find their way back into contention. But those dreams were quickly dashed when, you know the play, against the Eagles in the wildcard round. The double doink knocked the Bears out the playoffs, and once again, this was just a high point. Just a one-year wonder type of thing, as Mitch Trubisky immediately crashed back down, having a worse season in 2019. They went 8-7. Then in 2020, he only started 9 games. He went 6-3 and got to the playoffs once more, but was knocked out by Drew Brees. And then from there, after 2020, he never got back to the playoffs and was sent to Buffalo and then bounced to Pittsburgh, where he struggled there as well. And Mitch Trubisky is one of the biggest busts that the Bears have ever had. And I would understand if you wanted to argue that Mitch Trubisky is a bigger bust than Kid McMahon, just purely based off significance being the number 2 overall draft pick, and, Mahomes also being on the board. But it was a big mistake to take him as high as they did, to trade up for him, and to take him over the guys that he was taking over. And really, it was just another dark spot in the quarterback history of the Chicago Bears. While we have made it to last year's starting quarterback, this is not the final man we will be talking about, but this past year's starting quarterback and the last 3 years starting quarterback has been Justin Fields. They gave up an extra first to go up and draft him in the first round with the 11th overall pick, and it had been a rocky ride in Chicago for him, as really Fields has shown so many flashes of greatness but has not been able to sustain it. He dealt with some injuries in his rookie season. Things were really rough, but in his second season in 2022, despite going 3-12, he threw 17 touchdowns to 11 picks and became just the third quarterback ever to run for over 1,000 yards, rushing for an impressive 1,100 yards and 8 touchdowns. And really after that, Bears fans had gotten excited, and there was real MVP hype behind Fields going into 2023. Unfortunately, he started slow, got banged up, but in the second half of the season, once again shown incredible flashes with the acquisition of DJ Moore and hooking up with him. And Fields played pretty nice, and I still do believe that Justin Fields can be a nice quarterback in this league. Not to elite levels or top 10 levels, but a nice solid quarterback in this league. But when you get the opportunity of a lifetime getting the number 1 overall pick this year, moving on from Justin Fields was the only correct decision. And while he had a up and down 3 years, only winning 10 of his 38 starts, but having a fun ride, throwing 40 touchdowns and running for 14 more, he finds himself in Pittsburgh, who also, got the hand-me-down of Mitch Trubisky. Now they're trying to run it back with Justin Fields and see if he can be their quarterback of the future. Not a whole lot to talk about here, as it was a very short and fun time with Fields in Chicago, but he is just going to be a blip on the radar and potentially a trivia question of who was the starting quarterback before the next guy. It took us 105 years, but we made it. Caleb Williams, the number 1 overall pick in the 2024 draft, the highest drafted quarterback in franchise history. He has a lot of history, bad history, to overcome, and this team has been looking for a franchise quarterback for decades. And is Caleb Williams going to be the one? I can't say 105 years is exactly worth the wait, but for many Bears fans who have been looking for the guy, looking for the franchise quarterback, looking for someone that they can buy the jersey of, looking for someone that they can root for, you finally have it. You have a quarterback that is going to be truly special, truly incredible. We took a look at history, seeing the likes of Sid Luckman come through, win championships, the Hall of Famers that have passed them by like Bobby Lane, the what-ifs of Jim McMahon and his injuries potentially not letting them win more than 1 Super Bowl in the 80s, the disaster that was the late 90s and early 2000s, the what-ifs of having a competent quarterback in the mid-2000s that could have potentially given them a ring there, the Jay Cutler situation and what they gave up to get him, to Mitch Trubisky and passing on Patrick Mahomes, all the way to Justin Fields and moving on from him for this guy, Caleb Williams at a USC, one of the greatest quarterback prospects in NFL history, in my opinion. This storied franchise, known for defense with legendary defenders throughout the decades, has never had that legendary quarterback in the Super Bowl era. And the guys who attribute the offensive side of the football to is Walter Payton, but never the quarterback. Caleb Williams is heading into the next era and starting a new era of Bears football, where he will be the undoubted face of the team. And I think, without a doubt, and I know it's not a high bar, but this is the best quarterback in Bears history. He is going to step in the most talented thrower of the football the Bears have ever had, and he is going to have a legendary career for the Chicago Bears. And if all goes well, you very well could be seeing Caleb Williams lift the Lombardi Trophy high for Chicago. It's been 105 years. We've waited long enough. Caleb Williams, will you be the great quarterback that the Bears have been looking for? Only time will tell. If you made it to the end of this video and watched the whole thing, I appreciate it so very much. And if you could support the video in any way you want, liking, comment, subbing, all that other stuff, it would be much appreciated, as this took a lot of time and a lot of effort, a lot of research, a lot of making of the graphics, a lot of effort to make this video, and I really hope you all enjoyed it. And if you did, let me know what you think. Let me know what you want to see in the future, as I am trying to make these awesome, unique kind of videos. It's fun taking a look back in history and seeing how far the Bears have come over these 105 years and who could potentially be leading them into the future. As I hope you really all did enjoy this video, and I will see you all in the next one.